When H2k faced Samsung Galaxy in the Season 6 World Championship semi-final today, they find their opponents favoured by everyone to win, including H2k's players themselves based on interviews. But what if they did win? Now, that doesn't mean what if they are better than Samsung. Doesn't mean what if they are actually secretly the team that should have been favoured and all the rest of it. It just means what if they did it? What if somehow, some way, H2k wins this best of 5? That could be a 3-2 that's in insane fashion. Could be a 3-0 due to a breakdown or a player being sick on the other side. Could just be the game of their lives in this key 2-game stretch that gets them over the hump. Whatever it might be, somehow they end up winning, whether they're better team or not. Now, the crazy thing about the H2k guys is they actually do have a good enough core set of players, 1 to 5 in their team, that it's not impossible to craft purely individual matchups where you say, maybe that could happen, and this isn't that unlikely, and this one maybe even they'd have a decent chance on. That could all happen. The biggest thing to overcome with Samsung Galaxy is obviously the incredible macro of that team and the decision-making late game around objectives. That's something where H2K's had their own issues over the year. That's one of the things that stopped them winning big series in LCS, making the finals of LCS, winning LCS. So that in itself would be a massive thing to overcome. And right now, it's hard to see or conceive of the way that would happen. But what if somehow they win the series? Because the context for history and what it means for their careers would obviously be monumental. I mean, it's no exaggeration that the record of Koreans, especially in best of 5 series, this is the key thing, because that is like the premier, the marquee matchup of the highest standard of competition and play in League of Legends, and the most difficult to win in, is very bad for the foreigners. I mean, Western teams are only 1 out of 11 attempts in best of 5 series against Korean teams. They only won 1 out of 11. And that one time that they won was the first time that a Western team ever faced a Korean team in a best of 5. It was in the semi-final of OGN Summer 2012 in Season 2 when CLG EU of Froggen and Wicked faced Najin Sword, Macnoon, ironically Prey, who obviously played this tournament in Rocks. And they won that one, and that was it. Now, it's worth pointing out that Najin Sword of that time wasn't as sick as the one like at the end of the year going into the following year, which actually won the next season of OGN. But obviously, OGN Winter was a while away from OGN Summer because they had Worlds in the meantime, because they had their lessons to learn in the meantime of other key losses. Like, not only did they lose to CLG EU, but then they had to lose to Taipei Assassins at the Worlds and get upset. Then they had to lose to Azubu Blaze that had Shy standing in, who's still a fairly rookie player at MLG Fall Championship. So when you take away the first ever instance, it's just 10 straight best of 5 losses for foreigners, for Westerners. Now, a little note, a piece of trivia, in case you want to somehow make that sound not as bad that they lost 10 series in a row. Okay, in 7 of those 10 losses, the team that beat the Western team went on to win the tournament, which admittedly seems unlikely right now for Samsung Galaxy. You would favour SK Telecom to beat them in the final. So maybe that data is slightly skewed by them getting to face the best team in most of those tournaments. Often the case. But even so, the record is terrible. It's terrible for a good reason. It's terrible against, by the way, all the great Western teams. We're talking about CLGU themselves went forwards into the final of OGN, got beaten by Frost. We've got the great Fnatic team of Soaz and Xpeke. Yeah, they lost to KT Bullets, who at the time weren't even gods in Season 4. Then we go to TSM. The pretty good TSM that had amazing. They weren't bad, right? They'd started to get pretty decent in domestically. They get wrecked. Cloud9, the classic one with High and Sneaky and Meteos, they got beaten. Then we have the Fnatic that we all wanted to see win. Surely they can do it. This is the great Fnatic. This is the one that has the guys from Huni, Reignover. They got smashed by Coup. Origin had a cool run. Yeah, they got beaten by SK Telecom cleanly. This year, the newer Fnatic, cleanly swept by SK Telecom. CLG, oh, they made it to the final of MSI. Doesn't matter. Swept. And this year, the Worlds, obviously, Samsung Galaxy easily took care of, admittedly, a Cloud9 that doesn't really deserve on that list. Like, not one of the all-time great teams, but an okay team in terms of Westerners. Now, if H2K won this series, it would legitimately be the most important series won in the history of Western League of Legends. Now, sure, in terms of competition, it's not. Like Gambit winning the semi-final and final of IEM 7 Katowice in January of 2013 was much more sick in terms of competition because both of those opponents were top 4 OGN teams. In fact, Frost were the reigning champions of OGN at the time. And it was a historic event to win because not only did they get through the series, but in doing so over Blaze, they won the event and an event with top Koreans in. So add all that context together, yeah, that was more competitive, but you have to look at Gambit and say, well, those weren't best of 5 series for a start off. There was no blind pick component, so that actually makes it harder to win a series against Koreans in this sense. And Kesper teams hadn't arrived. The whole Korean team house system had only just started getting going. So the level of the gap between in certain senses of professionalism and practice and how to prepare wasn't the same way. And obviously it wasn't an OGN or a Worlds type tournament where you had like a whole week to prepare. They had a day to prepare for Gambit and then a few hours between. So not the same context of like if you really beat them when they were at their best and they had everything put towards their best effort in that particular sense. You could still have a surprise component to some degree. The other, obviously, one that would be a candidate for this title is CLG-EU. Because, again, in terms of, like, competition, I mean, CLG-EU beating Najin Sword, that's pretty big-time shit right there. I mean, that's still big to make the final of OGN. I mean, now we think of it as more prestigious because now we know that was the only time anyone ever went super deep in OGN. And that now we know if Westerns went to OGN, they wouldn't have a good chance of making it that far. So in hindsight, it's actually more historic. At the time, it was still just a very good tournament. And no one was certain Koreans would be absolute best in the whole world. But in terms of prestige and scale and scope, this is the biggest. I mean, this is Worlds. The pressure is more when you're at Worlds. This is the World Championship. This is something that matters on your legacy. This is the biggest line of them all. If you put down the resume and you can put finals Worlds, that goes above regional championships or above winning a small tournament. The opportunity, obviously, as a result, is far less plentiful to do something like this. I mean, you only get to do it once per year, Mac. And even then, maybe twice in a lifetime. In fact, some great players never get a chance in a lifetime. Then you got to add in terms of pure competition and prestige of the name value of the opponent, okay, Samsung Galaxy can't be as highly touted as that Frost team were. Obviously, Najin Sword went on to do more later, but even so at the time, they were actually probably slightly considered the same level or maybe a little bit better. Then you got to add in, okay, some of those old games, some of those old victories. Yet that was before the Korean evolution, before they adapted to pick band and become the best in the universe at planning for series. That was before they became amazing at adjusting from game to game and beating you even if you got an early win on them somehow. I mean, you've seen Koreans, you've seen Western teams and even Chinese teams take a game early but then still lose the series. That was before the Kesper teams came in and raised the level of professionalism and work ethic and dedication and scouting and coaching. That was before Korean solo queue went to an even more insane degree where now it just farms out insane talent that they try out and they weed out the ones that aren't good enough and the ones that stay end up becoming monsters. Let's think though what this would mean for the legacy of the players in H2k though, because the great thing about these players obviously is not many of them have ever had deep runs in tournaments or deep finishes in their careers. So Jankos and Vander have been known as some of the best support and junglers in Europe, arguably the best at certain points in time, for numerous seasons. For a lot of their career, they've been highly touted. Yet, they both have this legacy of underperforming or choking at the key moment, not living up to the peak of their powers, even if in the past they didn't have the greatest teammates always, having teams that should have been able to do it and never quite doing it. Never made an LCS final in their careers. This is their first ever Worlds that they've ever played at. Think about what it would mean for them to actually show that we weren't just potential. We really were the future when we were back then. We really were the Edward, the Gosu Pepper, and Diamond Prox of our era. We just didn't get it together as quickly. We got it together on the back end, and we had the big payoff at the end. Think about Ryu. This is a guy who has been super far, obviously. This is a guy where he was in the second best team in the world, probably could have made a finals or a top 4 of the world in Season 3. Didn't get the chance to, though, because of the circuit point system. This is a guy where he was in the final of OGN and was one game from winning, like CLG-EU, and was denied in that heartbreaking fashion the ZBZ matchup. This is a guy where last year, Worlds he came and he wasn't relevant. He was stuck in a group with EDG, with SKT, and his team couldn't do anything. And unfortunately, they didn't have as many sick players back then. And yeah, they got beaten, and it wasn't that convincing, quite frankly. This is a guy where you have to remember when he first came to the West. When he first came, he'd come from KT Bullets that hadn't been doing that well towards the time he came over. He comes over and he plays online with Millennium and he gets banged out and he's done. Millennium with Kevin and all those guys. So then he's looking for offers. He's not getting that many offers, by the way, guys. But then he stands in for Roccat, if you remember, instead of Nuke Duck at that IEM Cologne. And then he looks like he's going to beat CLG, I think it was. And, oh no, he loses to CLG and tries to style on them, gets fucked up. Oh, it was actually Overpower really trying to style them. And they lose the series, and everyone's like, yeah, you know what, fuck this Ryu guy, who cares? And he comes in H2k, and he helps turn around. He becomes really good, and he gets to a Worlds, but again, not relevant. Now he's at Worlds, and now he has a much better chance to go deep in the tournament. And if he does it, think about it, if he's the one to be, at the moment, he's probably the MVP of H2k if you look how they've played. If he's the one to carry or to help carry H2k, a Western team, not even considered the best Western team at any point this year or in this tournament, if he can carry them into the final of Worlds rather, a super deep mark, even he's never made it to, and when his corresponding number crown is a potential MVP of the tournament, is considered one of the very best mids in the world, is crushing everyone he faces, that would be some epic, incredible, like, final chapter to his career. That's some, like, Peyton Manning shit at the end of your career. It's not supposed to happen, you know. So this would be absolutely incredible. I'm talking about when Peyton Manning first went to the Broncos, obviously not just getting straight carried by that defense in that Super Bowl. So incredible for his career, and obviously getting rid of that whole like, chokes in the big moments type shit that people try to bring up for that guy. Now, Forgiven's obviously the one that we want to mention as well. Not a lot of success in his career team-wise. We know he's been fantastic individually, and at times he's been able to claim he's the best AD carry in the West, and the best Westerner maybe entirely, but he hasn't had the success. He hasn't had the deep runs. He's never been in a meaningful final, really. This is a guy, I mean, even in that IEM Cologne, made it to the semis, well, lost to ESC ever. Just never made the super deep runs and gotten those big accomplishments. This would be the ultimate comeuppance for everyone who said he'll never do it and he's too toxic. You know what? His skills are just too selfish now. They work. This would be the ultimate way to say fuck you to all those guys and to just potentially leave his career if he has to go to the army with a super high. I mean, this is a guy where he makes Worlds finals. This will be something he can actually say that the biggest tournament that ever mattered in the world for our careers, I made it further than Reckless. I made it further than Sven. I made it further than Double Lift. None of them could do what I've done. And it would be legit. You could argue and people could go there. It wouldn't matter. He'd be right. Now, Otto Armner's the last guy. This is a guy where, over this year, there's been times where, yeah, we've been praised. People have said he's really good and he's done a great job and he seems quite smart, but then he is a tilter. This is a guy who's made weird, inexplicable decisions in best of fives. So he manages to win in a world where Koreans have the god top laners. They have Smeb, they have Duke. No one can really go against these guys. Even when you get a mini Smeb, a Huni, they can't even fucking go against them. Now, sure, Cuvée right now isn't Smeb or Duke in terms of history or whatever, Flame or Shy, but he's, at the moment, probably the most improved player at this tournament. He's the guy where he's heading towards potentially being like an MVP candidate if somehow they won the tournament. I'm personally, I'd give it crown, but I know the way people think of the narrative, etc. And then finally, we've forgotten someone, haven't we? The sixth man, the coach, Prolly. Let's remember, first of all, as a Western coach to do this in the era of Team Houses and Kesper and best of five and having a plan and having a whole week, etc., of time to plan for these sorts of things. This is a guy where he has a history of draft fuck-ups. People criticize him. And draft fuck-ups sometimes in the sense of trusting a player when the player's going to make a silly comfort choice or just some panic pick. And he goes, I'll trust my player and go with him because I want him to have confidence. And that's cost him many times in his career. Then add in, remember, it's one thing if you coach in NA for the biggest box in the universe, and you got all the star players, and you want like the cool lifestyle and fan attention and plaudits and praise. He hasn't had that. He's been over in Europe. He's an NA guy who came over to Europe and did all this great stuff in Europe. And now imagine if he's the one that leads them past it. There've been times when we said he might be the smartest coach, he has an interesting grasp on the meta. This would be such validation for him, right? And also, even in his career with H2k, this would be so rare that they could have such a big win, right? H2k, the past with Yarn and those guys, yeah, they couldn't do a whole lot. They were a good team, a smart team, a team who could play interesting macro League of Legends, but they didn't really have the players to do it. Then when he got the players to do it, they were choking, they were tilting, they weren't getting it done when they got to those big best of fives. He's also someone who's had a lot of heartbreak in the fifth game of best of fives. Now, there have been many, many great Western teams, some really fantastic ones, some that actually probably could have made it further than even H2K's made it now. But you know what? Winning this series wouldn't make H2K the best Western team of all time. You could maybe make some sort of skewed argument for it, but what I would say is it will automatically make H2K one of the best of all time. And it would certainly stake a unique claim for being the best, or being in that conversation where you can't just dismiss them out of hand. And that's without ever winning a tournament. So who knows if it will happen? I mean, the odds say no. History says no. Many factors say no. Samsung getting this macro for a start off, an ability to bait Baron. But imagine if it did happen.